Well, welcome everyone to the Rothermere American Institute, Oxford's multidisciplinary centre for the study of America and its place in the world. I'm Adam Smith, the director of the Institute, and I'm very proud to introduce the first of our new Alain Locker seminars. Locke, the Dean of the Harlem Renaissance, was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, and we're very proud to name this seminar series and the collection of materials on African American history in the Vere Harmsworth Library in Locke's honour. This seminar series will highlight the growing collection of books and resources in our library focusing on Black history and culture. And I want to take this opportunity to warmly thank the Association of American Rhodes Scholars for their very generous support for this new collection. So my role here today is to introduce the chair of this session, who in turn will introduce our speaker. So the session today will be chaired by Emily West, who's the Professor of Early American History at Oxford, a Senior Fellow of the RAI, and a leading scholar of enslaved women in the antebellum United States. Among her publications are Family or Freedom, The Expulsion and Enslavement of Free People of Color in the Antebellum South, Chains of Love, Slave Couples in Antebellum South Carolina, and she's currently completing a book which is under contract with Cambridge University Press called Cooking for the Quarters, Enslaved Women and the Labour of Care. Emily joined us here at Oxford at the start of this academic year, and it's a huge privilege and a pleasure for us to welcome her and to work with her. And Emily, thank you very much for chairing our inaugural Alain Locker seminar. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Adam. And yeah, it's really, really great to be here. And we're having a series of introductions today because my job is to introduce Professor Richard Blackett for this inaugural event in our Alain Locker seminar series, as Adam said. It's a really important initiative for us. And yeah, I'm so pleased to be introducing Richard today. I think that I've actually known you, Richard, for nearly 30 years. So that's a considerable amount of time. Professor Blackett is Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University in the US, and he's a world-renowned historian of the abolitionist movement in the USA, especially the roles played by Black Americans in the fight to end slavery, and abolitionism's transatlantic connections, especially here in the UK. Indeed, Richard himself studied in England, firstly at the University of Manchester, and then at Keele University as a postgraduate. He also has really strong and important links with us here at the University of Oxford, having been a Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History in 2013 to 14. Professor Blackett has numerous publications, a really extensive list here, so I'm just going to draw attention to a few key ones today, including Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, The Escape of William and Ellen Craft from Slavery, Divided Hearts, Britain and the American Civil War, Making Freedom, the Underground Railroad and the Politics of Slavery, and The Captain's Quest for Freedom, Fugitive Slaves, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law and the Politics of Slavery. Richards has served as president of both the Southern Historical Association and the Association of Caribbean Historians, as well as numerous other initiatives. He sits on various editorial boards and awarding committees, both in the USA, but also here in the UK, for example, an MA fellowship that's run by the Kinder Institute at the University of Missouri, alongside British 19th century American historians. Today, Professor Blackett is going to talk about his 2023 biography. I have a copy here, not upside down, Samuel Ringgold Ward, A Life of Struggle. This is published by Yale University Press's new series entitled Black Lives. And Ward's a really interesting character. We know less about him than some of the other abolitionists of that time, partly because there are so few sources about his life. But this life is indeed one that's fascinating, transatlantic, and we're in for a real treat this afternoon. Finally, from me, a bit of housekeeping. We hope that there's going to be time for a few questions after Richard's talk. If anyone wants to ask a question, sorry, this is bringing back pandemic memories for me, but if anyone wants to ask a question, feel free just to pop it in the chat on this Zoom function. And what I'll do is then I'll convey some of these questions to Professor Blackett at the end of his talk thereafter. We hope in total the whole session is going to last for no longer than an hour, just so you can prepare yourselves for that. So without any further ado, then I'm going to hand over to you, Richard. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Emily. This is a great opportunity to launch a new series here from the RAI, named in honor of one of the giants of the 20th century, Black American history and literature, who also has such deep connections to Oxford. My plan today is to talk a little bit about this man, Samuel Ringgold Ward, and then leave time for questions at the end. I first became interested in Ward when I was working on my first book back in the 1970s, in the dark days of the 1970s, a book that turned out to be to examine the role of Black Americans in the Anglo-American anti-slavery movement. Ward played a critical role in that movement in the 1850s, and I had planned to do some work, a more extensive biography on Ward on my second book, but he proved much too elusive for me to track him down in the 1970s, before the days of when there were massive collections on Black abolitionists, as well as the ability to reach out to other archives. So I came back to Ward recently when I was asked to do a biography in this series published by Yale University Press. And the intervening time between the 1970s and now has given me an opportunity to get deeper into the life of a man that I think was an incredible character. Okay, looking back over the many years in the trenches, fighting against the twin evils of slavery and racial discrimination, Frederick Douglass remembered a Free Soil meeting in 1848 that he attended in Buffalo, New York, with Samuel Ringgold Ward and a number of other African Americans. Ward, Douglass recalled, attracted particular attention, and this is an extensive quote from Douglass looking back over 50 years towards the end of his life. As an orator and thinker, Douglass said, Ward was vastly superior, I thought, to any of us, and being perfectly Black and of a mixed African descent, the splendors of his intellect went directly to the glory of race. In depth of thought, fluency of speech, readiness of wit, logical exactness, and general intelligence, Samuel R. Ward has left no successor among the colored men among us, and it was a sad day for our cause when he was laid low in the soil of a foreign country. There's no better description, I think, of Ward and his contributions to the struggle for Black freedom, citizenship, and equality. There's also that sad coda to the reminiscences. Ward had given up the struggle, turned his back on America, and had ended his life in obscurity in a foreign country. The final sentence of Douglass's reminiscence may explain why Ward and others like him, who gave up on America, have largely escaped the biographical's gaze. By leaving America, Ward and those who followed in his footsteps stepped off the pages of American history. There's yet, until I did it, a full-blown biography of the person who many contemporaries considered one of the giants, both physically and intellectually, of his generation. One biographer, one earlier biographer, attempting to explain Ward's later life, described it as both remarkable and strange. He could have added elusive. Samuel Ringgold Ward was born a slave on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1817. Where exactly, we do not know. Two of his members of his extended family were born enslaved in roughly the same area and will later also escape and contribute enormously to 19th century African American history. Ward and his parents escaped when he was a mere 3 months to rural New Jersey, southern New Jersey, where they settled among other fugitives from slavery in an area dominated by Quakers. Years later, Ward's parents moved to the relative safety and anonymity of New York City, where he attended the African Free School, whose alumni included some of the leading African American intellectuals of the antebellum period, including James McEwen Smith, who the first Black American trained doctor who got his degree from 3 degrees from the University of Glasgow, Alexander Crummell, who himself in the 1850s got a degree from Cambridge, and William Howard Day, who got his degree from Oberlin, among many others. Ward experienced the full force of American racism when a white mob attacked an anti-slavery meeting he attended in 1834 as a young 17-year-old. It was in a way, a baptism of fire and an introduction to the struggle that would come to dominate his life for the next 20 years. 4 years later, Ward was ordained a Congregationalist minister. In 1841, he accepted the offer to minister to an all-white congregation in South Butler, New York, in the far reaches of upstate New York, the first Black American to be so appointed. For many, it represented a slight crack in the edifice of racism. Years later, Ward moved to a larger and another all-white congregation in Cortland, New York. It was in this period that Ward established himself as one of the leading figures in the struggle against slavery and discrimination. He was employed as a lecturer for the American Antislavery Society, and when that society split in 1840, Ward threw in his lot with the new American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, believing that the Constitution and involvement in the political process offered the best means of confronting slavery and racial discrimination. He was a mainstay of the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party that nominated him for a state assembly seat in 1848 and would later nominate him as a vice presidential candidate. The Liberty Party did not make much headway politically in the period, but nonetheless they set a standard of open opposition to slavery and discrimination. 2 days later, Ward issued his manifesto as a candidate for the position in the state assembly. He said he was opposed to the war against Mexico, which was coming to an end, and the expansion of slavery in any of the territories gained by America. He condemned the clause of the Wilmot Proviso, which allowed for the return of fugitive slaves. He called for the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. He was opposed to the internal slave trade. He insisted on the recognition of Haiti as an independent nation. He demanded the prohibition of alcohol, although he wasn't averse to holding a glass now and then. And he pledged to fight for the full restoration of the right to vote of the state's 40,000 Black citizens. The manifesto tells us much of what we need to know about Ward's commitment to the cause of freedom. The following year, Ward started his first newspaper, The True American, which he merged with another newspaper that became the Impartial Citizen, that would become the organ of the Liberty Party. The anti-abolitionist riots riot in New York in 1834, and a constant struggle against racism warned Ward in ways that few of his contemporaries and we in this period could understand. There were moments such as in 1839 when he considered a future in a place where the pall of racism was not so overwhelming. He thought seriously about moving to the British colony of Trinidad following the end of the apprenticeship scheme in 1838, the official end to slavery in the West Indies. But in the end, he chose to stay and fight. There were, however, constant reminders of the growing political influence of American slavery. The Supreme Court's decision in the Prigg case in 1842 weighed heavily on him. The Prigg case made it ruled that the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law was the supreme law of the land, and it had to be obeyed, although it left a wee opening for states by arguing that states did not have to actively enforce the law, that was the responsibility of the federal government, which meant that states could in the future at least set up laws that made it increasingly difficult for the law to be enforced. But the Prigg decision had a really negative and daunting effect on people like Ward and many of his contemporaries. All of this coincided with his discovery that he was not born a slave, something his parents had kept from him. Evidently, his mother informed Ward's wife, not Ward, of his status as an enslaved person. He was no longer a free black, as he had always thought, but a fugitive slave, a man without free papers and vulnerable to the capture and return to slavery in Maryland, a man in effect without a country. I have tried, and I tried in the biography without much success to understand the sort of psychological impact of Ward with this news and why his mother decided not to tell him prior to this period. And when she did decide to tell, not to tell him directly, but to tell his wife, who then relayed the message. But the impact must have been enormous, psychologically and otherwise. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, he took personally as an existential threat. The law of 1850 put more teeth into the enforcement of the recapture of runaways. His public defiance of the law made him even more vulnerable. Ward had returned to Syracuse from a long, grueling lecture tour of the West in 1851 to find the city torn and in turmoil over the capture of a Missouri slave and the threat of him being returned to slavery. Jerry, the slave, was being held in the local jail pending his extradition. Ward and others visited him in jail, in his cell, and not too long after, a crowd stormed the jail, freed Jerry, and sent him to Canada. All of this in the wake of the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. The president, Fillmore, and his administration made it abundantly clear they were going to enforce this law come hell or high water, and anybody who got in the way would likely suffer the consequence of their breaking of the law. Ward and others who assisted him therefore realized, and particularly in Ward's case, as a newly minted fugitive slave, fearing arrest, followed Jerry to Canada. He would never return. Ward did in Canada what he had done in the United States. He became a leading voice in the newly formed Anti-Slavery Society of Canada that devoted much of its energy to providing for the rising number of fugitive slaves who were entering the country in the wake of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. He was also the founding editor of the Provincial Freeman, the first number of which appeared in March 1853. The Provincial Freeman was the first Black newspaper, first Black Canadian newspaper, and Ward was one of its founding editors. Ward left soon after the appearance of the first issue of the paper on a tour of England to raise funds for the society, leaving the newspaper in the capable hands of its other founder, Mary Ann Shadd. I tried to cover much of Ward's time in Britain in my first book, which is titled Building an Anti-Slavery Wall, Black Americans in the Atlantic Abolitionist Movement, which was published in the dark days of 1983. Ward was a rousing success wherever he went in Britain, raising substantial sums of money for the society and promoting the cause of abolition in the United States. He lectured widely on slavery, temperance, peace, and missionary activity. He sometimes found himself at loggerheads with British supporters of the American Anti-Slavery Society, but by and large, Ward stayed clear of the controversies that continued to beset the movement in the United States. Like many other Black Americans who visited Britain, Ward moved in some heady social circles, rubbing elbows with lords and ladies who invited him to social events where he was lionized. They were fascinated by his color, his size, a very Black man, over 6 foot tall, and weighing, as one besotted admirer estimated, 16 stone. I don't know if Ward would have understood what stones are. The fascination with his physical features led one admirer to observe that his circle of chin whiskers could be seen only at close quarters. What that had to say about Ward and his admirer, no one seemed to know. Ward enjoyed the adulation and never missed an opportunity to remind his audience of his passionate commitment to the freedom of the slave and the elevation of his people. I am devoted to Black people, he told the Colonial Missionary Society in his first speech in London. I have none of the prejudices against their color that some people have. I am married to a Black woman. Although closely allied with the free produce movement in the United States, Ward threw his weight behind the movement's cause while in Britain, a movement that had come to life again in the 1850s. The cultivation of sugar, cotton, and other agricultural staples on which the British economy relied, its supporters maintained, could be more cheaply produced by free labor in its West Indian colony, reducing the country's reliance on slave-grown produce and in turn undermining slavery where it still existed. And to many extent, Ward and his contemporaries had a keen eye on the textile industry's reliance on Southern cotton. The freedmen in places such as the West Indies, many believe, needed a guiding and helping hand if they were going to succeed in the trying decades after final emancipation. Ward's cousin, Henry Highland Garnett, himself a former slave, had accepted an appointment in Stirling, Jamaica as a missionary of the United Presbyterian Churches of Scotland, while Ward was in England. Ward would soon follow. John Chandler, an Essex Quaker who had toured the West Indies in the years since emancipation and who owned land in Jamaica, offered Ward 50 acres of land on the understanding that he would raise crops for export. Success, Ward and his benefactors hope, would attract Black settlers from the United States, as well as encourage the cultivation of staples by freedmen on the island. The fact that Ward had no experience in agriculture didn't seem to bother his admirers and supporters, nor did it seem to bother Ward. Ward left for Jamaica in 1855. The last step, the last stage in his exile. We know very little about Ward's years in Jamaica. On arrival, he seemed to have settled in Kingston, the capital, where this longtime Congregationalist minister became involved with what Jamaicans called a native Baptist church. Nothing more was heard of Ward, or very little was heard of Ward. We have some interesting and very salacious court testimony, which I could go into in the question and answer period if anybody is interested. But nothing really substantial was heard of Ward. He moved about Jamaica, particularly around the area, the sort of wider Kingston area, where he ran a school with one of his daughters and participated on the fringe of local politics. Ward's position always was to the peasantry of Kingston: be patient, things will get better. The economy of this island depends on you, not the landowners who insist on growing sugarcane or any of the others. You, the peasantry, are the future of the country. Little was heard of Ward until 1866, when he re-emerged in the months following the Morant Bay Rebellion that took place in October 1865. Led by Paul Bogle, a small landowner and a native Baptist minister, and supported by George William Gordon, a colored member of the local assembly, the rebellion sort of devastated the whole island economy. Excuse me a minute. It was the most politically consequential event in the years since emancipation. It started as a protest by peasants demanding more land, a demand the authorities resisted. Demonstrations outside one local courthouse in Morant Bay turned violent when the authorities called out the militia. Shots were fired. The demonstrators retreated only to return and set fire to the courthouse. That set in motion open rebellion that in the end resulted in the loss of hundreds of lives and the destruction of property. Both Bogle and Gordon were captured and summarily executed. In a short pamphlet published in early 1866, and in testimony before the commission sent out by the British government to inquire into the causes of the rebellion, Ward denounced the leaders of the rebellion and supported the actions of the governor and other local authorities. Ward's position has continued to confound historians. Here was a proud Black man who made much of his attachment to the support of the rights of Blacks. A man who in the United States was a driving force in the movement to eliminate slavery and discrimination. Here was a Black man taking the side of the colonists, or at least the administration of the colony, in the effort to deny the rights of Black Jamaicans. He was deeply and passionately opposed to Gordon. He described him, he dismissed him as a sort of mulatto upstart, a position that Ward had, in his relationship with Douglass, had never expressed. They may have had differences, but Ward deeply respected the work and the approach that Douglass took. He himself, a man, a mixed race man. Ward's reaction to the rebellion may help to explain the lament of Frederick Douglass's memory of him. He said, and I repeat, "It was a sad day for our cause when he was laid low in the soil of a foreign country." Compared to Douglass's reaction to the failure of John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry 6 years before Morant Bay, Ward had sadly fallen from the lofty perch he had attained as the advocate of the slaves. I will end there, and hopefully we can have some questions.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that wonderfully rich and detailed talk about Samuel Ringgold Ward. I just want to ask before I move on to questions. There are some questions coming through now, but I just wanted to ask about Ward's physicality, because I was really struck by your commentary about people mentioning his physicality, mentioning his presence when he came to Britain. And obviously on your biography of him, I hope everyone can see this here, we have this really striking image of him on the book's cover. And I just wondered if you could comment a little bit more about that. Like how many photographs of there do we know whether these comments, which perhaps have a sort of a racist tone at times, do we know whether they actually bore any resemblance to his physical appearance, and how much survives? Because I know we're plagued by sort of archival issues about his life story, but is he also lacking in sort of in images and photography as well?
Yes, that is only one of 2 images that we have of Ward. There may be a third, but he was a striker. I mean, even I use the long quotes in England because that is where most of that kind of description comes. But there are similar descriptions of him in the United States, of his size and of his blackness, but also because leading to the next part of those quotation is also his eloquence.
Yeah.
Those were the 3 things that people mashed together in order to, I suppose, as a way of saying, look, there are Black people, unlike Douglass, who is of mixed race, there are unadulterated Black people with a wonderful command of the language and intellectual and is self-taught, etc., etc. So yes, those descriptions jump out at you, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to quote them because they're there all the time.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter. It's not a class thing. It's not, members of the upper class had the same. Harriet Beecher Stowe says the same things about him. So all those descriptions are, I think, are apt, and they clearly hit you because no one else is described in a similar way. None of his contemporaries that are. If you see descriptions of Alexander Crummell, who was also very black and not, as they used to say in the 19th century, not tainted by the white brush. There are no similar descriptions of Crummell. So Ward stands out in that sense as having a unique impact on his audiences who felt the urge to describe the person they saw before them.
Yeah.
And always, as I said, it's mixed with his eloquence and his command of the language.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And I was also thinking about what you'd said about him being both an elusive character, but also, as you said at the start of your talk, he really is an incredible character, due to this intellect, his journeys as well, however we conceptualize that. How did your perception of Ward change, if at all, in the writing of this biography? Did you find that your own views changed, or did it confirm what you thought you knew about him beforehand?
Mainly it confirmed, but I think the one that remains an open question is why he took the position he took in Jamaica during the Moran Bay Rebellion. I am not absolutely convinced. Some have argued that he saw himself as a British subject and therefore became more Anglophile than anybody else could have imagined. But I don't, because as I mentioned in the introduction here today, Ward's position in Jamaica is that the folks who ran the country, the colonial administration, as well as the black elite, so to speak, in Jamaica, were retarding the progress of the country. And really it is the ordinary working people, the peasants, who really keep the engine that drives the economy of the country. But on the other hand, he looked at what was happening during the Moran Bay or leading up to Moran Bay, and he pleaded with them not to fall prey to those people who were promoting violence, because he knew they couldn't win, or at least that was his position, or at least that is the best spin I could put on Ward in this position. And one, as I suppose a historian, one has to try and understand, if you're writing a biography, you have to dance a little bit with the subject that brought you, but you have to keep them at arm's length at the same time. So it is that effort on my part to kind of balance Ward, but that's his conundrum. And that is the conundrum that he have left historians with.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. Thank you for that, Richard. I'm going to move on to some of the questions in the chat now. Firstly, we have a question from George Keys, who asks, what is known of Ward's tenure as a congregational minister to white congregations?
We know a little bit from the archives of the missionary association to which he was a member. Their papers are housed at Tulane, and the American Missionary Association was formed in 1846 as an association that opposed the existence of the participation of slave churches or pro-slave churches and missionary societies in their business. So Ward was supported to some extent in his endeavors at these churches, and therefore we have a little insight. But it was hard. The first church in South Butler in upstate New York is a small church. One of the curious findings at the end of all of this is that although it was an amazing gesture on the part of the congregation to reach out to this black guy and say, hey, Sam, would you come and minister to us? At the end of his period at the church, his family were the only Black members of the church. So, and there were Black people, there were Black citizens of the county and the area who one suspects may have joined the Congregationalist church, but never did. And I suspect that is because they didn't believe in that kind of high intellectual, whatever it is that Ward was spouting at his churches. So that was his first church in South Butler. And then he moved to the second white church in Cortland, which is not far away from where Gerrit Smith was the kind of dominant figure in the place. Gerrit Smith was the largest landowner in the state of New York and also a rabid abolitionist. And everybody in Gerrit Smith's circle around this area were staunchly abolitionists. So this is a church that was accommodating and welcoming to Ward. Yet when that church tried to form a local chapter of the Temperance Society, of the American Temperance Society, that society removed them from the list of possible members. And that, for Ward, was another example of how ingrained American racism was. So here he is in a white church, all of whose members now have created this new chapter of a temperance society, who now have to turn around and go through the ignominy of having to lose because one of their members is their minister, who happens to be Black, and the temperance society doesn't want this to happen. But Ward remained a Congregationalist. He never changed until when he got to Jamaica. There was really no Congregationalist membership to go on, and he just attached himself to the Baptists and continued involvement in the rabid Baptist politics. The Baptist Church in Jamaica is the largest Baptist church anywhere in the Baptist world in this period. So it is unavoidable if you're in Kingston. You have to join the church or some element of the church.
Thank you.
But we don't know much about the details of his Congregationalism, because although he's a deeply religious man, he doesn't. There is less of the kind of philosophical disagreements and other kind of disagreements over his religious affiliations.
Thank you so much for that, the detailed answer there, Richard. I have another question from Gretchen Raw and a comment as well, which I'll read out as it's been written here. Firstly, she says, "Thank you, Professor Blackett, for your many contributions to our histories of slavery and liberation." She then goes on, "I'd love to hear if Ward had any role in the design and failures of US Reconstruction. I understand he rejected repatriation, but did he support compensation? How can great historians best inform today's causes for reparations, particularly overcoming barriers to demonstrate the continuing lineage of harm and the consequences of tracking and enslaving Africans?"
Yeah, that's a heavy question. Thanks for the compliment first.
Yes.
Ward and Reconstruction is a blank. Nada, nothing. Because he dies, as far as I can pinpoint it, in 1868-69. So before Reconstruction really is in motion. Once in Jamaica, I have found only a couple mentions of life in America. I mean, Ward went into exile. And not only that, his colleagues, he lost all contact with colleagues. It's a strange happening that I have not been able to disentangle. There's one incident where an editor from upstate New York sent him a copy of of the editor's newspaper. How he tracked him down in Jamaica, I don't know, but Ward received it. And Ward was so ecstatic about having some kind of contact with his American past that he agreed to write articles for the newspaper, a series of articles about the nature of race and color in Jamaica, which is an important topic. He wrote 2 of them, as far as I've been able to find, and I never found a third. So that for all intents and purposes, Ward is severed his connections with his past in America. And similarly, America has severed its connections with Ward. So it is a mutual, and again, that's why the coda to Douglass's statement is so appropriate. That he is buried. We don't even know where Ward is buried. We don't know where he died and when exactly he died. There's some suggestion that his son, also named Samuel Ringgold Ward, remained in Jamaica, but the Jamaican archives are not very helpful in tracking that down. So Ward really has little connection with Reconstruction. And the final part, so therefore, I suppose it precludes me having to get entangled in the question about reparations on this cold day in Nashville.
Okay. That's fine. We can move on to a question from Beth Wilson, which is about thinking about how you went about finding Ward in the archive and how you navigated gaps in the archive when you were trying to trace Ward's movements. Could you say a little bit methodologically?
Gaps haunt African American history or other kinds of histories. And I have come to the conclusion that you push against the holes that you find until such time as you can push no more, and then you have to throw your arms up in the air and say, hell, I can't find it. There's nothing. Hopefully something would show up later on, and then you move on. That's how you try to address the gaps. I do not address gaps by creating fictitious history. I don't do it. I can't do it. It's not in my DNA to do that kind of things. And if I say in any of my work that I have written, if I say maybe this might have been, if I say that more than twice, it begins to, my teeth go on edge, my intellectual teeth are on edge. I dislike it when I see people doing that. But that's a personal problem.
But then it was interesting though, Richard, because you did speculate a little bit. For example, you were thinking about the psychological impact of of his mother's actions, in talking to his wife about how he was enslaved, and you speculated a little bit there.
Yes, I did. Mea culpa on that one. I did. But the reason I did it is because it haunted me. I don't know what is going on. And in the end, I still don't know what was going on, why his mother did what she did, and why she chose to tell his wife and not say, hey, Sam, I have something, a bit of news that I would like to relay to you. She doesn't do that. So there's something going on there. And then what impact did it have on Ward? He never mentions it. But it seems to me it must have had an impact when all of a sudden he realized that he is not who he thinks he is. So again, that is one of those gaps that leave you wondering how best to address it. But at some point you have to just move on, or else you become immobile.
Yes, that's
or very true. Or you make stuff up.
Yes.
I spent my entire professional life telling my students not to make stuff up. So that's my personal dilemma.
Yeah, so I'm jumping around in the questions a little bit now. Apologies for those of you who've submitted questions, but just picking up on this, we've had similar theme. We've had a question from Dick Ruffin, who asks, what do we know about Ward's wife and their relationship? Can you elaborate a little bit there? I was just thinking about this in relation to what you were just saying about other passing.
We know her name, we know where she was born, but We know roughly how old she was. And again, because I can't track her in census. So I can't know exactly where she was born. Or we think it's in New Jersey. The problem, and this brings up another problem. Ward's exiles, the length of period he spent away from his wife and family. Ward goes to Jamaica in 1855. It doesn't appear that his wife actually comes to Kingston until 1858 or 59. So in that period, they are totally separate. I have one letter from her. I have another letter that mentions she and the children going off to Jamaica, finally, after Ward left them in poverty in Toronto when he went off to England, living the grand life. So he may have defrauded people to get money to go to Jamaica. And when the man arrived in Toronto to pick up the money, he finds that Ward's, and there are a series of long letters in the papers of the Antislavery Society of Canada that says the person arrives in Toronto to collect his money from Ward. Ward isn't there, and his family are living in poverty. And there's a letter from his wife to Gerard Smith saying, please ask Samuel to come home and stop. I mean, because he was supposed to go to England for just a brief period, but he kept putting it off, partly because he enjoyed his time in England, but also because he was working in a milieu that he found very comforting and very accommodating, without any of the kind of harsh realities of life in America. And therefore he didn't want to return. But there, again, those are the gaps. Here are gaps. Why does the man leave his family for such a long period of time? Now, males in the 19th century, I discovered, did this wasn't infrequent. Okay. This long periods of separation, but Ward seemed to have been particularly long.
Yeah.
And it's another question I can't answer.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't a womanizer. There's no evidence that Ward was gadding about the place enjoying himself. This man was working, and trying to make ends meet, and raising money for the society. And so I can't, again, another gap.
No, we can speculate a little bit, but ultimately, he seems such an honourable man. Yes. Yeah.
There's no evidence. Nobody said anything nasty about Ward and that score.
Yeah, exactly. George Keyes asks, did Ward make any observations on the US Civil War when he was in Jamaica? In particular, do we know anything about what he thought of the eventual enlistment of black soldiers in the Union efforts?
No, he didn't. What he did do is is again, in the context of the rising tensions in Jamaica, he kept saying to the peasantry, look, we are going through a terrible time in Jamaica because of the crisis created by the war in the United States. Because Jamaica, like many other societies and Caribbean societies in this period, had imported most of their foodstuff from the United States. So Ward is saying to the peasantry, look, there's an opening here, we need to pursue it. But that is about the only thing he meant. That's the only time the war comes up in Ward's discussions that I have found.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. And then I guess this might be the final question, but I also wanted to come back to this theme which keeps coming up again and again and again, this idea of exile from the United States, feeling ultimately that the United States is so racist that he can't be there. Perhaps even, he'd prefer to be away from his family, if that means being away from the United States. And I wondered, Richard, I know this is a biography, a very important biography, but I wondered if you could just maybe contextualize a little bit about that, because I know you've obviously written about other abolitionists in transatlantic contexts as well. How common is it for people to want to leave the United States, especially those involved in abolitionism, and how many people make these types of journeys?
Many did. I mean, but not of the intellectual or leadership cadre.
Yeah.
I mean, Ward is unique in that regard. Alexander Crummell goes, after he graduates from Cambridge, he goes to Liberia, and he remains in Liberia for decades. But ultimately, he returns to the United States, where he has a major impact on intellectual developments in the 1890s and the turn of the new century. Ward, on the other hand, because he dies when he dies, we don't know if he was going to return. But I get the distinct impression that Ward had no interest in returning to the United States. So in that sense, he is a unique character. He may have been the only one who doesn't return. Others left for a brief period of time. His cousin was in Jamaica for a brief period of time. J.W.C. Pennington left for a while. The Crafts left for a while, but they returned. So there is a draw that brings people back to America because there's a struggle, a continuous struggle that folks want to remain involved in and feel they have a contribution to make. But because when Ward dies, at the time at when he dies, which is the end of the 1860s, I think one has to conclude from that there's no evidence that he was going to return, but I don't know. In the end, one doesn't know, but he is the only one. He's the only Black contemporary major figure that does not return to the United States.
Okay. Thank you so much, Richard. I'm just going to sneak in one sort of final question here, and that is, do you have any plans for any more biographies, or if not, what's your next research projects? Could you finish by saying a little bit about that?
No, I think I maybe have done.
Okay.
I may be done with biographies, but one doesn't know. I'm in the midst of writing a history, and your husband might appreciate this. I'm in the midst of writing a history of football in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, I'm coming close to finishing it. And when it's done, I don't know what else I will do. We will see.
That's absolutely fair enough. But Richard, thank you so much for sharing this wonderful work with us today. As we've just put on the Zoom chat, we're going to be publishing this event as well as other events in the Alain Locker Seminar series as well. So do go to the RAI website if you want to know more about that. But thank you so much, Richard. Again, really, really appreciate you coming along today. And thank you everyone for attending and the wonderful questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily.